The Coen Brothers' 1988 film, The Big Lebowski, is an amalgamation of many different film genres and points in film history, from the Western to the Busby Berkeley musical to the film noir. The protagonist, the Dude, functions as a sort of neo-noir detective, shambling about Los Angeles County in an attempt to uncover a kidnapping plot involving the eponymous Big Lebowski's young wife, Bunny. A comparison made explicit in the film when an actual private detective hired by Bunny's family compliments the Dude on his work. There are also other invocations of film noir archetypes, such as the mysterious woman Maud Lebowski and the porn producer Jackie Treehorn, a humorous stand-in for the mob boss typical in noir narratives. But despite its noir trappings and inclusion of the adult entertainment industry in its plot, The Big Lebowski takes a more ambivalent approach to its depiction of sexuality and the passionate undertones common to both classic film noir and many neo-noirs. The film is acutely concerned with castration anxiety, including many literal and symbolic threats to the phallus. However, despite that anxiety, the sexuality of the Dude and other characters like Maud and Bunny are not handled in the typical patriarchal way by reinforcing the subordination of women. Through its depictions of sexuality and masculinity, The Big Lebowski presents the aspiration towards that kind of power, represented by the symbolically impotent Big Lebowski, as ultimately pathetic and unsatisfying. The perversion of the patriarchal order of the wealthy Lebowski family in the film sets the narrative up for critique of the heteronormativity present in cinema. In reference to classic films noir, Sylvia Harvey argues, the kinds of tension characteristic of the portrayal of the family in these films suggest the beginnings of an attack on the dominant social values normally expressed through the representation of the family. The Lebowskis rebuke those dominant social values in many different ways. First, there's the fact that Bunny Lebowski is younger than her own stepdaughter Maud. Tara Reid is 15 years younger than Julianne Moore, upsetting the legitimized and naturalized values of competitive, repressive, and hierarchical relationships present in American society by giving Maud more power than one of her own parents. Also, Maud and her late mother actually have more power than the so-called Big Lebowski. Maud reveals to the Dude that it was her mother's family that was rich, not her father's, and that she lets her father pretend to be independently wealthy while giving him an allowance, just like he does with his wife Bunny. This inversion of fiscal power upsets the patriarchal family relationships, and the strange and compelling absence of normal family relations hints at important shifts in the position of women in American society. The theme of emasculation of both Jeff Lebowskis also manifests in the theme of castration anxiety. According to Laura Mulvey, one of the functions of woman in forming the patriarchal unconscious is her symbolizing the castration threat by her real absence of a penis. However, while Maud and, to a lesser extent, Bunny, embody that castration threat in certain ways by overturning the patriarchal order of their family, castration anxiety in The Big Lebowski appears most explicitly in the conflation of disability with impotence. Though ableist tropes founded in fears and misconceptions about disability, paralysis as a signifier of impotence, and threats of dismemberment as a signifier of castration revealed the sexual anxieties of both the Big Lebowski and the Dude. The Big Lebowski is a wheelchair user, a common signifier of sexual impotence in cinema and often a metaphor for other kinds of impotence and incompetence, such as the fact that the Big Lebowski doesn't actually have money of his own. This impotence is further implied by the Big Lebowski's lack of interest in his young, attractive wife Bunny, whom the narrative suggests is simply an attempt by the Big Lebowski to illustrate his wealth and privilege, rather than someone he actually finds sexually appealing. For the Dude, who is able-bodied, the threat of potential maiming and thus, by ableist proxy, castration is much more explicit, including moments such as a rabid ferret being dropped into a bathtub near his groin, his spilling a hot drink onto his lap, and a drug-induced dream ending with men chasing him with giant scissors. And then there's the dismembered toe, a literal reminder of the potential for disfigurement that haunts the Dude throughout the rest of the film and clouds his judgment when trying to assess his case. On a more symbolic level, the Dude's begrudging employment to the Big Lebowski functions as a way of making him impotent. It is this factor of being forced to work according to the goals and pursuits formulated by someone else that accounts in large measure for the feelings of alienation and helplessness in film noir. The constant threat of castration for the Dude seems at odds with his more laid-back and subversive presentation of sexuality. Unlike many aggressively sexual or suave-leaning men, the Dude is to Maud, and even Bunny, as Grant is to Hepburn in Bringing Up Baby. He is the pursued. This is in part because Jeff Bridges' masculine style is self-possessed, relaxed, and, partly because it includes a certain disinterest in his own attractiveness, or an acceptance of it as a given, relatively non-aggressive. Both he and Cary Grant seem, as Philip French says of Bridges, free of protective egotism. In a similar vein to his masculinity, the dude's sexuality also seems free of that egotism. When Money offers to fillet him for $1,000, the dude seems more amused than genuinely interested, as he jokes that he needs to go get cash for her. Later, in Maud's apartment, when she shows him a tape of an adult video starring Bunny and one of her nihilist friends, he simply comments sarcastically that he thinks it ends with the man fixing Bunny's cable. And while at Jackie Treehorn's garden party in Malibu, the dude mentions he would enjoy mingling with Treehorn's guests, presumably his adult actors and actresses, within the context of the scene, it seems more like he's simply trying to escape Treehorn and his wrath. The most interesting illustration of the dude's sexuality lies in his relationship with Maud Lebowski. In the dude's first conversation with Maud in her studio, he stares in awe at her and the painting she had just been working on, causing Maud to ask him if he's intimidated by the female form, also noting that many men are uncomfortable with the word vagina. Later in their conversation, Maud starts talking about sex in order to segue into a conversation about Bunny. When she asks the dude if he's interested in sex, he seems somewhat confused and never actually gets to answer in the affirmative, as Maud cuts him off and says, "I like it too." Later in the film, when Maud uses beaver as a euphemism for vagina, the dude calls back to their earlier conversation and asks, "Do you mean vagina?" And finally, when Maud shows up in the dude's apartment and demands that he love her, dramatically dropping the robe she's wearing to reveal her nude body underneath, the only thing he comments is, "That's my robe." The dude is clearly comfortable with sexuality in the female form, to the point where his comfort almost comes off as disinterest. The dude has sex with Maud, but the film shows the audience absolutely none of it, cutting from the aforementioned scene with the dude on the floor to the following morning with the two of them in bed fully under the covers, Maud asking him decidedly non-sexual questions about his life. Also, the motif of lighting a cigarette post-coitus to indicate sexual satisfaction is undermined, with the dude having a coughing fit and crawling out of bed to get dressed. Even after literally having sex, there is little in the dude's countenance that indicates an interest in sexuality or sensuality. The only time we see the dude seem truly aroused and interested in sex is during his Busby Berkeley fantasy, which is explicitly presented as a Jackie Treehorn production, with the dude's costume even mimicking the TV repairman in the pornographic film Maud showed him earlier. Far from the victim of femmes fatale or otherwise alluring women that the typical heterosexual film noir protagonist is, the dude comes across more like an asexual man who enjoys sex but doesn't actively seek it out. Like the dudes, Maud's sexuality in the film upends patriarchal and heteronormative institutions of sexuality. While Maud is apparently a nudist, appearing in every scene either fully unclothed or only wearing a large robe to hide her nudity, the camera doesn't objectify her body. The only time we see her fully nude figure is from a distance as she takes off a harness and puts on a robe. Moreover, in spite of the male myth that feminists don't like sex, Maud confidently exclaims that she enjoys it, remarking that it can occasionally be a zesty enterprise. Still, Maud is not quite as confident as she appears, hypocritically accusing men of being afraid of the word vagina while being unable to say the word penis without euphemism. She also seems to have some old-fashioned views about sex, equating it with love and accusing people who engage in it outside of love of having nymphomania or satyriasis. For instance, she accuses Bunny of being a nymphomaniac, citing an adult film she starred in as proof, even though what we've seen of Bunny thus far indicates she has a more transactional relationship with sex than an addictive one. And, once again proving herself to be a hypocrite, Maud engages in coitus with the dude not out of a sense of love, but a desire for a child. According to Toby Miller in Nature of the Gays, women look on childbearing as compensation, cause, and replacement for their castration. However, Maud defies the patriarchal narrative norm of a woman who is isolated, glamorous, on display, sexualized, but then falls in love with the main male protagonist and becomes his property. In fact, the opposite happens. After using the dude as a glorified sperm donor, she cuts all ties with him. As Thomas Byers notes, where for Susan in bringing a baby, heteronormative romance is the ultimate end, for Maud it is simply a means to conception and deliberately single parenthood. And like many women in film noir, who contrast greatly with Mulvey's description of objectified women in cinema, Maud's rejection of heteronormativity reflects the ideological safety valve device that operates in the offering of women as sexual commodities that breaks down in probably most films noir because the women are not finally possessed. Like the dude, Maud navigates sexuality outside of the confines of heteronormativity, despite ostensibly being presented as a heterosexual woman. While the depiction of the dudes in Maud's sexuality seems quite progressive, The Big Lebowski is hardly above falling into the pitfalls of the male gaze. However, its unique presentation of ambivalent heterosexuality and parody of the veneration of the phallus illustrate that the filmmakers are at least somewhat aware of the patriarchy embedded in many narrative devices used uncritically in neo-noir and other genres of cinema. As a film with two male writers and a male producer, director, cinematographer, and editor, along with the female editor Trisha Cook, it's not surprising that the male gaze seeps into the film. According to Mulvey, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. While Maud and Bunny have agency in the film, the costuming and styling of them and the other female characters are much more sexualized than the male characters. And despite the presence of male porn actors in the plot, we hardly see any men shirtless, let alone fully nude, while depictions of topless and fully naked women abound, as the male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification, while woman displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle. The presence of nude women in the film, aside from titillation of straight male viewers, likely stems from the film's concern with castration, as while women on screen lack the penis and therefore represent the threat of castration, they help to signify, in fact they absolutely embody, sexual difference, which is comforting for men, so women are sights for sore male eyes. That said, the film doesn't reduce all the women in the film to pure spectacle, and it rejects the model of masculinity often tied to that sort of objectification. In addition to the derision of the Big Lebowski, the portrayal of Walter contributes a great deal to the film's critique of the phallus. Walter, a veteran and much more proactive character than the dude, who is right about every twist and turn in the case, is characterized as a macho buffoon stuck in the past, both in his obsession with Vietnam and the continuation of traditions he had with his ex-wife. Masculinity that lacks protective egotism like the dude's, which also entails more equitable treatment of women, prevails as the aspirational form of masculinity that the film endorses. Despite The Big Lebowski's homage to classic films noir, its approach to addressing sexuality is radically different than them in other neo-noir films such as Chinatown or Sin City. While the film takes advantage of a relative lack of censorship, depicting nudity and referring to sex without allusion, it doesn't present sex in a particularly titillating manner that caters to the scopophilia of its heterosexual male spectators. Nevertheless, it's clear that the filmmakers presume heterosexuality as the default, unmarked position of characters in this film, and that characters like the dude and Maud are supposed to be straight. The only character with potentially intentional queer coding is Brandt, the Big Lebowski's sycophantic yuppie assistant. Yet the dude and Maud don't truly belong within patriarchal heteronormativity, defying expectations placed on them regarding sexual desire, marriage, and parenting. While their defiance could merely be a part of their eccentricities, to me it illustrates their queerness, specifically various forms of asexuality. Due to both heteronormativity and the difficulty in depicting the lack of something rather than its presence, I feel like asexuality is little discussed in queer readings of cinema. Male characters who do not show explicit interest in women are typically presumed to be heterosexual but informally celibate, or gay and possibly repressed. Yet I feel the dude does not fall into either of those categories, expressing a profoundly ambivalent sexuality that rejects the sexual frameworks often applied to analysis of cinema. Maud also complicates typical discussion of female sexuality in film, enjoying both the physical and procreative aspects of sex, but not taking part in patriarchal or heteronormative institutions of marriage or even non-marital romance. Though likely intended to be an unmarked heterosexual main character for male audience to project themselves onto, and an eccentric artist emblematic of some of the sillier aspects of feminism, the dude and Maud Lebowski proved to be interesting specimens for the analysis of asexuality in film.